Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I hope everyone had a wonderful weekend with their families. I am looking at an avalanche of notes on my desk, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into the show. And I figured the best place to start is when I was away on vacation and doing other work, I had come across one of my favorite World War II stories, and it's interesting because there is an ocean of World War II content that I could go through, but there are certain things that just stand out because it's so insane. And this particular story is one of them, and I guess the best place to start this story is with a guy named Alan McGee. Well, McGee was born a New Jersey kid back in 1919, and what happened with McGee is that he ended up joining the Air Force shortly after Pearl Harbor occurred. That was very normal. So he joins the Air Force and was made a ball turret gunner. And if you don't know what a ball turret is, a ball turret gunner is the low gun on a B-17 heavy bomber. It's basically the guy beneath the plane in a ball turret gun position. And that ball turret is totally exposed when you look at anybody on the craft. It's outside the chassis of the plane. Well, so here he is, it's 1943, and he's on a B-17 named Snap, Crackle, Pop. That vessel was doing a daylight bombing run over France. And that happened to be McGee's 7th mission. So it's January 3rd, 1943. They're over the skies of France. So here's McGee. He's in his ball turret, and the ball turret itself was hit by German flak. So McGee climbs out of the wreckage of the ball turret into the fuselage. And what he did in the fuselage, he determined that his parachute had been damaged and it was inoperable. So again, here you have this guy. He's out of the destroyed ball turret. He has a damaged parachute. He's in the fuselage. So what McGee does, McGee starts moving to the radio room, and the ship is hit again. So the vessel, again, is the B-17 is hit again by German flak. So the second hit, German flak blew the right wing almost totally off. Well, with the right wing gone, what happened is the plane went into a flat spin. So it's a flat spin. These guys are moving super fast, and McGee blacked out. He blacks out at that point because of a lack of oxygen. The plane is like whipping around. So here he is. He passes out, but the problem is the plane's still spinning, and his body is not secured. Well, so the plane's flipping around. He's not secured, and what occurred is that McGee was actually thrown clear of the aircraft. Literally, this guy just flipped out of the plane. So he's over the skies of France. McGee flies out of this B-17 bomber into open space. McGee fell 4 miles. He fell 4 miles down. The speed of his descent was actually calculated at 120 miles an hour. So the unconscious McGee falls 4 miles. He lands on the top of a railroad station in the French town below him. But a miracle. Well, that railroad station had a glass roof. So McGee's unconscious body shatters the glass as he's falling out of this plane. Well, what happened was that glass impact ended up mitigating the impact to his body. So German troops found this man alive on the floor of the station. He had 28 shrapnel wounds. He's got broken bones, laceration. His right arm is nearly severed off. Well, McGee survives all the shrapnel, the armish, all of it. He survives, and he's taken in as a German POW. Well, the Germans ended up nursing this guy back to health, and McGee ended up being a POW for 2 years after that. So McGee was a German POW until 1945, and he was finally liberated. Well, after that, he got a couple of awards. He received an Air Medal and a Purple Heart. McGee died in 2003 in San Angelo, Texas, but it's interesting that French town that he fell into was named Saint Nazaire. So in that town, Saint Nazaire, they built a 6-foot tall statue to McGee to commemorate the attack and the American defense of the town. The Smithsonian listed McGee's fall and his survival as a top 10 survival story of World War II. But that always just blew my mind. This guy gets chucked clear of a B-17. He flies 4 miles down at 120 miles per hour and lived. Well, obviously that story is crazy in and of itself, but why did I think to tell that story? Well, the reason I wanted to tell that story is because over the weekend I saw another similar story that I had never heard. Now the second story is about a guy named Norman Jackson. So Jackson was an Englishman. He was born in Middlesex. So Jackson enlisted in the Royal Air Force, the RAF, in 1939. Well, in 1943, he was assigned to a Lancaster bomber. And if you don't know what Lancasters are basically the English version of a heavy bomber. It's like a B-17 adjacent plane. So this Jackson guy had actually finished his tour of duty. He was done. And 30 missions was the cap for RAF guys, Royal Air Force guys. They do 30 missions, that's their tour of duty, and they're done. Well, he was finished, but Jackson ended up volunteering to fly with his old crew one last time. So this is his 31st mission. So on this mission that he wasn't even supposed to be there, and these guys fly out at night. They fly out at night to bomb a German ball bearing factory. So they accomplish their mission, they drop the bombs on the factory, they start heading back. Well, as this Lancaster is heading back to base, the plane was attacked by a German fighter pilot. Well, this German fighter pilot ended up hitting the fuel tank of the Lancaster. It was on the starboard wing of the craft. So here's Jackson. He's on a plane with a burning fuel cell on the starboard wing. These guys all know what's going on here. Every single man on that Lancaster knew that fire would ultimately end up blowing the cell. And it would happen not in a little bit, it would happen almost immediately. Well, so Jackson realizes this situation, that they're dealing with a situation that's going to become terminal in seconds, and he's the flight engineer. Well, he's already wounded by shrapnel, and he decides to act. The only option that this man had, he put on a parachute and grabbed a fire extinguisher. So puts on a parachute, grabs a fire extinguisher, and climbs out onto the burning wing. They're flying at night. He's got a 200 mile per hour wind in his face. It is pitch black. There's no lights. It is completely pitch black out. 20,000 feet in the air. So this guy crawls out on the wing with a parachute and a fire extinguisher, moving 20,000 feet in the air, 200 miles per hour, totally pitch black. So he's fighting this fire on the wing. He's midair and blind. So Jackson is able to stymie the fire to the point where the pilot could regain control of the craft. The problem that the guys on the Lancaster were dealing with was the German fighter plane. It wasn't done with them. So the German fighter pilot came back in for a second strafing run. So this German fighter pilot, loops back and he strikes the aircraft. That second pass ended up hitting Jackson's legs. So he's got shrapnel wounds already. He's fighting a fire on the wing of this plane, and then he gets shot again. Well, the second he gets shot, for whatever reason, the fire flared up again. So fire burns his hands and face. Well, what it also did is that it blew him off the wing. So Jackson now is blown off the wing into the black night. His parachute is half burned. It's got holes in it. This man, Jackson, fell 4 miles with a busted parachute. It's almost the same thing as McGee. So he flies 4 miles off the wing with the busted parachute. He ended up landing alive. He was able to create enough drag to where he landed alive. He shattered his leg. He broke his ankle. Remember, he had shrapnel wounds. He was shot. So here's Jackson. Same thing as McGee. He's caught by the Germans, and he spent 10 months as a POW when he finally escaped from the prisoner camp. So this guy comes back to life. And the interesting thing about it, his crew, the guys that he was with, had been forced to ditch out of the plane. That plane crashed. So all the guys on the plane thought that he was dead. They all thought Jackson was dead. They just saw their comrade get whipped off into the night sky. They just figured he was a goner. But 10 months later, here comes Jackson. He returns to reality. He was already a war legend. These guys had already like canonized him. He was like the biggest badass ever. They all thought he was dead, and then all of a sudden he shows back up. His crewmates all saw what he did. So there was witnesses to what he did. So almost immediately when Jackson comes back to life, he was awarded a Victoria Cross, which is like the Medal of Honor for England. But if you think about what this guy did, that is one of the most unbelievable acts of courage that you could probably dream of. So not only is it super courageous to go out on a wing like that, but the fact that he survived is just a total miracle. And I thought it was interesting. So this Jackson guy, he survives this crazy experience. He survives the war overall, and then he became a salesman for Haig whiskey. So he was just a liquor salesman afterwards. But this brave man ended up having 7 kids, and he died in 1994. And it's interesting because Jackson is such a stud. His Victoria Cross was on display at the British War Museum for years. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I had not heard that story about Jackson, and I was thinking about McGee. Anyway, I thought it would be a fun way to start the week. So hopefully you enjoyed that. So switching gears, I got more than a few texts about my comments regarding Governor Maura Healey out of Massachusetts from last week's show. So again, just to reframe this, Healey is the governor of Massachusetts. She's the one that signed this full-term abortion bill. Full-term abortion bill. So Healey had signed this thing with this like coven of white liberal women cheering it on. And my issue beyond the codifying of a full-term abortion bill in the macabre spectacle of a coven of ghouls cheering it on was Healey's proclaimed faith. Healey claims to be a staunch Catholic. And again, cradle Catholic here. I, as a cradle Catholic, have plenty of issues with the church, but I understand the dogma and the positions of the faith. And I don't know much, but I do know that the Catholic Church is supposed to be 1,000% against abortion. And that is not a debatable point. I think the core of the issue here is that, and I mentioned it last week, is that this whole thing is perceived as a civil right to some people. And in full disclosure, I understand the logic. I get the logic of how they arrived at this decision. Because if you perceive to be abortion is a civil right, then you're going to feel a moral imperative to uphold the civil right. But the challenge I think that most people using common sense have, the issue is by that logic, then you're also in the same breath, you are discarding the morality of ending a life. So you're upholding morality to a civil right, but you are discarding the morality of ending a life. And I think the problem here broadly is definitional. I think definitions are the challenge in our society. And I was trying to think of a good example of this definitional problem. And here's a good example for you. When 50,000 Muslim fighting age men land on a foreign shore, how would you define that? What would you define that as? Because I know that the Spanish prime minister and the head of the EU saw that as a humanitarian crisis. To someone who uses the English language in a fluent manner, there would be another definition. When 50,000 Muslim-age invaders land on my doorstep, the definition that I use is invasion. You see the difference there? Liberal, woke people have a very serious problem with definitions. And that issue with definitions has permeated the left. And the WNBA is a great example of this. They can't define what a woman is. It's so simple. They're sitting here twisting themselves into a pretzel to define a woman. The league name is WNBA. Women NBA. Why is this hard? Understanding what a woman is would seem to be critical to running that league called the WNBA. But the woke administration, the people that are running that circus, are unable to define what a woman is. They had to have an all-day meeting about it, and they still couldn't provide an answer. It's semantics. It's definitions, right? In our society today, we have a Supreme Court justice who cannot define what a woman is. If we have a Supreme Court justice that is unable in her confirmation hearing to define what a woman is, small wonder regular people who are not Harvard educated judges, they struggle with this also. Kachani Brown Jackson could not define what a woman was when pressed upon it at a confirmation hearing. Look, for law, for legal purposes, definitions are very critical. Definitions are critical to proper logical constructs in application of the law. And I'm going to walk through the train of logic here just to kind of summarize my position. When one person kills another person, what is that called? The definition that I use is murder. That is the appropriate definition. So I'm going to expound on that logic. I'm going to break it apart. So a murder, to be completely clear, is when one set of DNA, i.e. a person, kills another set of DNA, i.e. a person. That is logical, correct? That tracks, right? So if one set of DNA kills another set of DNA, it's called murder. Then that logic must be applied elsewhere. And is an abortion the same thing? A baby does not share the mother's DNA 100%. That baby is 50-50 of the mother and the father. So again, a definitional exercise using common sense. If one set of DNA kills another set of DNA, it's murder. So therefore, when pro-life people talk about definitions, that is accurate in abortion. Murder is the correct definition to apply onto abortion. And look, I understand all of this, guys. I understand rape and incest. I understand violent acts. I understand non-viable births. I understand medical issues. I think most people that think through this whole scenario of abortion logically, I think this is most people's issue, right? When I pull the trigger of a gun, what happens? When I pull the trigger of a gun, it starts a process that is irreversible. Striker hits primer, ignition, bullet flies at target. It's the same with a baby. When an egg is fertilized, that starts a process that is then irreversible. Life is created at that point. So therefore, at any point, if you terminate that life, you're stopping a process that is already initiated. This is why definitions matter. That clump of cells is a growing life. It's not growing into a tumor. It's not growing into another organ. It is growing into a secondary life. It is another set of DNA. That clump of cells has DNA that is separate from the mother's. Cells are multiplying. Cells are multiplying minute by minute. That's life. And look, beyond the basic definition of this, full-term abortion is too much for most people. I would prefer no abortion if I'm being a logical person looking at definitions. But I also realize that that position is not politically viable. So the question that American society needs to wrap its head around, what is the line here? Again, as somebody that believes in all this stuff and believes in definitions, I want zero. But unfortunately, we live in a world where politically you have to concede that point. So if I concede the first trimester, is this enough for these ghouls? It's not. They want full-term abortion. You're talking about a viable birth at that point. They're talking about you could abort the baby the day before pregnancy. Full-term means that baby is viable. That is too much for the common man. Most people, that is too much. And again, this is a layered, very dense issue. It's a challenging issue, but for sure, if we have a challenging issue like this, then definitions really matter, man. Definitions matter, especially if you're going to have an argument about a subject that is this complex. And where I come out on it, 63 million abortions have occurred. 63 million abortions have occurred in the United States since Roe versus Wade. 63 million abortions. My question to anybody defending this, how many of that 63 million were lifestyle choices? It was an abortion of choice. I just don't want to deal with this. If the argument is zero, then we aren't being honest. If the person that is arguing for pro-choice, if your argument is that zero of the 63 million abortions were not lifestyle choice, then that's not an honest argument. So the question then is, what percentage were lifestyle choices? Was it 1%? Was it 2%? 5%? Because at 10%, you're talking about 6.3 million abortions that were lifestyle choices. 5% of that is 3.15 million. Even if you look at the lowest number, which would be 1%, 1% of that number is 630,000 abortions, terminated lives that would be lifestyle choices. But if you ask me, one is too many. One lifestyle choice abortion is too many. And again, I understand rape, incest, and medical issues. I get all that. But 630,000 abortions, that is more deaths than World War II had. That is just a massive number. So moving beyond that, I'll go back to Healy. Why does the Catholic Church not excommunicate a person like this? I don't understand it. She should be denied communion. She should be excommunicated. And I'll just expand that logic. I mean, go beyond Healy. When you have the Pope meeting with Pelosi and Biden. I understand meeting with heads of state. Pelosi and Biden claim to be staunch Catholics. They're also trying to codify abortion. So my question is, if the Pope knows that these two people are trying to codify abortion as a political law in the United States of America, how does the Pope then not throw them out of the Vatican? And if I look more specific to Massachusetts, where are the Catholic faith leaders protesting the governor? Because the question is, how is the governor that claims to be a Catholic upholding the faith? And I said it a minute, how is she even allowed communion? Like in her local parish, obviously the parish probably knows that the governor is a parishioner there. How does the pastor of the church not say, hey, you're not allowed in the building and you're not allowed communion? That's a mortal sin. And if I back away from this, I think that this is a growing issue with a lot of faiths, not just the Catholic Church. This is happening in Protestant churches, Lutheran church, you name it. It's happening all across the board. And I think it's very, very damaging to society. What this whole issue is doing, it's creating a shifting goalpost inside of a faith. And faith leaders right now are grappling with this. You have a fractured flock. Flocks have been cut in half. There is a schism that exists now in most churches, most religions, and it has to deal with politics. And if I look at the Catholic Church, again, as a cradle, I want the Catholic Church of my youth. I want the fire. I want the brimstone. I want stories of men and women walking into the lion's den shielded with their faith. I want men dying for their faith. I want moral courage. I want conviction. I want strength of purpose. And what I see in modern society is a lot of churches, not just the Catholic Church, a lot of churches here are trying to thread a needle. Because if I look at like a Healy, it's very obvious that whoever the pastor is of Healy's church, that man, whoever that is obviously conceded his positions. It's obvious. If he's allowing that to continue, he's trying to thread a needle. Maybe he just wants the governor as a parishioner and likes that. He likes that situation. But how could the pastor not identify that this lady has committed a mortal sin and cannot receive communion? By doing that, by not throwing her out, by not excommunicating her, what's occurring is that the clergy, priests, rabbis, whoever, they're conceding their moral high ground. They're allowing the flock to move the goalposts. And quite frankly, I don't really quite understand it. I think the only conclusion that I can arrive at is that most clergy, again, regardless of denomination, most clergy is empathetic. And that's great. I really appreciate empathy, but the problem with it is you're empathizing yourself right off a cliff. You are conceding pillars of the faith. You are conceding your positions when you give an inch like this. That pastor just gave her a yard. And when you give an inch, you give another one and another one and another one. And the challenge with all this is that by doing this, by the priest allowing this, it doesn't matter if it's a business, it doesn't matter if it's a school, it doesn't matter if it's a faith. What happens is that leaders of all these things cater to the lowest common denominator. The problem with it is when the priests start catering to the lowest common denominator, what you're doing is you're leaving behind the people that did not concede their morality. People like myself. So I've got half of a congregation that's following this lady down a cliff. They think what she's doing is amazing. And you've got the other half of the congregation sitting in this church with Maura Healey, and they're puking all over themselves because this lady has just committed a mortal sin. And the challenge that I have with that, if you look at any faith, everyone knows the rules when you come into a faith. And the problem with it is if you look at faith broadly now, you have half of a congregation in any church you walk into that apparently wants new rules. And again, definitions matter. Changing rules and shifting morality is not a faith because there's no moral baseline. There's no shared moral baseline. And it's emerging more and more now. You have all of these churches that are experiencing this like dichotomy of belief now. And the church is just a marker of society. And the problem with it is my opinion, my political opinion about people like Healy, about Biden, about Pelosi, when I look at them and they abandon the principles of their faith for political ends, my perception of those people is shaped by that. So Joe Biden can sit here on MSNBC and squeal about how he's a staunch Catholic from Scranton, but the problem with it is he is a full-throated abortion activist. Because the problem there is I have a different understanding of the Catholic faith than that they do, obviously. Last week was August 14th. Last week was August 14th, and when I was raised in the church, I knew that day. And I'm going to tell you a story really quick, maybe help you understand my position here. One of my favorite Catholic priest stories revolves around something that happened on August 14th. And again, this is the faith that I knew. This story helps hopefully to enhance my position of the Catholic Church. What happened on August 14th, and what does that date mean? And I'll start this whole thing with a guy named Maximilian Kolbe. Well, Kolbe was born in Poland in 1894. And at that time, Poland was a kingdom. So Kolbe was only 9 years old when he told his parents that he saw a vision of Mary. And as a side note to this story, before I really get into this, a side note, I'm a Marianist. A Marianist is a segment of the Catholic Church that venerates Mary. Kolbe broadly was known as an apostle to the consecration of Mary, so he was an important figure in the Marianist faith. So this is how I knew about this guy. I've known about this guy forever. So anyway, Kolbe sees Mary in a vision. At just 9 years old, he said that Mary had come to him and offered him a choice, a white hat for purity or a red hat for martyr. Kolbe told his parents that he chose both. So he wanted to be a martyr. He also wanted purity. Well, this kid is obviously steeped in faith then. He was sent to Rome at 15 years old. So while he's in Rome, World War I breaks out. Well, Kolbe's father wasn't in Rome. He was at home fighting. Kolbe's father was part of the Polish legions in World War I. Now, his father was actually captured by Russians in World War I. Captured by Russians and hanged as a traitor. The execution of his father by the Russians was traumatic to Kolbe, who's still in Rome. But he continues his studies, right? What choice does he have? Kolbe, while he was in Rome, saw organized demonstrations against the Catholic Church. He saw violent mobs. He saw violent mobs that wanted justice. He saw Freemasons arguing with the church. Well, what happened was because of all of this anger that was directed at the Catholic Church in World War I, that series of events led Kolbe to form a group called the Militia Immaculate, which translated means Army of the Immaculate One. Well, that group that he formed was focused on enemies of the church. But he didn't go out and fight them. What he did is he would pray for his enemy's salvation. And he wanted to make sure he wanted an organization would stand against these people that were trying to attack the church. But this idea of praying for your enemies reflects the hate the sin, love the sinner ethos that I understand in the Catholic Church. So he's praying for his enemies, but he doesn't want them attacking the church. So by 1918, Kolbe was ordained. After he was ordained, he returned to Poland. So World War I is over at this point. He's back in Poland. Well, Kolbe ended up preaching. He taught in Krakow. Well, if you know anything about what was going on in Poland at the time, and like that 1918 era, Poland was fracturing. Polish society was grappling with the birth of socialism and communism. Russia is right next to Poland. So here you have Russia right next to Poland. It's in the throes of a communist overthrow. Well, Kolbe was no fool. He saw World War I. He lived in Rome. He understood the attacks on the attacks on faith that communism presented. He was adamantly opposed to communism as an ideology. And I just mentioned a second, communism at its core is anti-God. It's anti-religion. The state is what matters, not God. Well, Kolbe traveled from Poland to Japan during the 30s. What did he do? He was opening monasteries. He was talking about the Army of the Immaculate One. So he was proselytizing. He was spreading the faith in Japan. But his rhetoric changed. What he was doing, he started providing a militant ideological defense of the church against the rising tide of this anti-God behavior that was being shown in communism. He started to become more militant in his speech because he saw what was happening in society. My point with this is that Kolbe knew right from wrong. He would be the guy like myself in the Catholic Church today, standing on principle, standing on history, standing on the common rules. But living in Poland, being in Japan, think about Japan in the 30s. They're getting ready for World War II. This man saw all of this up close. He saw communism up close. He saw fascism up close. He could define it. He could use his words to define the problem. Well, if you fast forward, Kolbe ended up going back to Poland. He was actually in Poland in 1939. And if you know what happened in Poland in 1939, September 1st, the Nazis invaded. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Now, Kolbe could have fled. He could have fled, he could have run away, but what he did is he stayed behind and he worked in hospitals for the injured. Well, September 19th, just a couple weeks later, Kolbe was arrested by the Nazis. Kolbe was then asked to sign documents that would recognize his German ancestry, and he refused. Now, why does that matter? If he had signed those documents, that would have given him his freedom. He would have been recognized as a German. He would have been given his freedom if he had just signed that paperwork. His refusal to sign those documents made him a political dissident. Well, Kolbe ended up getting released while the Nazis continued their takeover of Poland, but he was a marked man. Well, what happened was by 1941, the Nazis had shut down that hospital and monastery that Kolbe was at, and they arrested him again. So here's Kolbe. He was arrested in Warsaw in 1941, arrested in Warsaw, and he was transferred to Auschwitz. So in Auschwitz, Kolbe attended to the sick and the dying. He was beaten and starved by his Nazi captors. Well, what happened was in late July 1941, a prisoner escaped from Auschwitz. So a prisoner escapes from the concentration camp, and all of the inmates were rounded up. They were all rounded up and then warned. The camp commander told the prisoners of the escape, and then he was going to provide a punishment. So the camp commander instructed the guards to pick 10 prisoners. Those 10 prisoners would be locked in a basement and starved to death. They would be starved to death as a punishment and a warning to the rest of the inmates. So the guards go around, they start picking 10 victims. So as they're picking out victims, they picked a Catholic Polish guy named Francis Gajawonek. So they picked this Gajawonek guy, and as they're pulling him out of the crowd, he cries, quote, "My wife, my children." He had a family. What happened is that Colby stepped forward. He stepped out of the mass of inmates. Colby stepped forward and volunteered to take his place to die in the basement. Colby and 9 other prisoners were condemned. They were locked in a basement to die horribly. Now, the jailers would go down there and they would check on the condemned. When they went in there, they would notice that Colby was usually kneeling in prayer or he was comforting others. 2 weeks of this. After 2 weeks of starvation and no water, only 3 people were left alive. Colby was still alive after 2 weeks of this torture. So the Nazis are getting bored by this whole exercise. They're eager to finish the job. They want to clear the basement out. So what it was decided at that point is that the remaining 3 prisoners, the remaining condemned people, were to be given injections of carbolic acid. So the prisoners are told this. And here come the Nazis. They walk into this basement. The jailers, the Nazis reported that Colby merely raised his right arm and he didn't struggle. But Colby died August 14th, 1941. Again, I knew about this story. Colby was actually canonized. He was made a saint by Pope John Paul II in 1982. Colby's views on Mary were produced in Vatican II. Churches all across Poland bear this man's name. That is the Catholic faith that I understand. That is the Catholic Church that I recognize. The firm chin, the resolute faith, the belief in God as you enter the lion's den. I recognize Colby. I recognize that strength. What I don't recognize that same courage when Catholics are permissive on things like abortion that are black and white. And again, I look at it, it's not just a schism in the Catholic Church. It is a schism with faith in general. Modern society is moving these goalposts. Modern society is moving these goalposts really to the left, I guess is the best way to think about it. The challenge for this, the challenge for people like in the Catholic Church is, I'm sitting here reading stories of Maximilian Kolbe. Having a story of a man that acted in this selfless manner, that knew right from wrong, that hated communism, all the things that go along with it, like I could look at a story in history and I can appreciate that strength. And again, like if I look at that story, how could I look at that story of strength and not want to emulate it? But people seem to forget about that as they're shifting left. Again, they've taken up the yoke of civil rights morality. And I guess when I look at this even further, like the parallel for me, lens of COVID, I think it's so interesting. Because I just think about all this stuff, right? 80 years ago, you had 17-year-old boys storming the beaches of Normandy. 80 years ago, you had men running into their death, and then we wore masks in COVID running inside out of fear. In 80 years, you just had this precipitous drop in moral character. And I feel like something's been lost. It's somebody that's almost 50 years old. I just feel like something has been lost. It's like the heart has been ripped out of so many things. And it's disheartening. Because I look at a person like Kobe and I want to be that guy. I want to try to live up to that ideal. I don't see anything like that in the Catholic Church now. I certainly don't see it in the pastor of Healy's congregation. But if you think about like a guy like Kobe, Kobe is no different from any of the people that I talk about in like Medal of Honor situations. He's a person that you should try to aspire to. And Kobe knew definitions. You have to do that now in modern society. We have to call evil for what it is and then confront it. But I've just been thinking a lot about this whole situation and like this, you see this issue with Healy acting in this manner that is completely contrary to the Catholic Church. You see a non-existent or a tepid response from the Catholic Church. Like real leaders and people that really believed in God, like if you truly believe in an afterlife, if you truly believe that God was real, you should be standing up and saying, no, you can't do that. But I guess the pastor doesn't want to do that. I guess the cardinal doesn't want to do that. I guess the Pope doesn't want to do that. Anyway, it's just been really something I've been thinking about a lot. So those are my thoughts on old Healy and what's going on in Massachusetts. So one last topic. I saw something the other day and I wanted to make a comment on it because I thought it was really interesting. And I suppose that, to be fair, this is one of my key political issues. So if it's one of my key political issues, I suppose it's germane to the show. But I guess the best place for me to start this whole kind of conversation is with prohibition. And I think anybody that knows anything about prohibition, like when prohibition became legal, there was obviously an unintended consequence of that action. And that consequence was a black market. You had a massive black market that sprang up in the US for booze and liquor. And black market, obviously by definition, is operated by gangsters. And these gangsters aren't choir boys, right? These are serious men running illegal enterprise. And with the operation of a black market, obviously firearms are going to be part of that. Now, Tommy guns were very prevalent back then. And a Tommy gun is an automatic submachine gun. It's a Thompson machine gun. A Thompson machine gun shoots 45 ACP from a magazine in full auto mode. The Tommy gun was so synonymous with mob gangland violence that they called it the Chicago typewriter. And it's interesting because back when all this was occurring with prohibition and all the gangland violence that went with it, back then it was totally legal for civilians to acquire and own full auto weapons. And again, the Tommy gun was so, you see any mob movie from that era, you see a Tommy gun in it. Mobland violence with a Tommy gun really came to a head in 1929. You had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, if you're not familiar with that, it was like a mob shootout. You had elements of the North Side gang that were gunned down by guys that were wearing cop uniforms, and they were all armed with Tommy guns. They wasted these guys. They shot like 130 bullets at 7 dudes. Well, 7 men were shot dead in this like mobland violent act, right? And back then, back in like the back in the roaring 20s, that was a jarring thing. I mean, you could read about 30 people dying in Chicago this weekend. When 7 people got gunned down in Chicago 100 years ago, it was a big deal. But people broadly in American society were very, very upset by that event. So you have this mob, all this mob violence with Tommy guns. You see the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Well, a couple of years after that, there was an assassination attempt on FDR when he was the president-elect. And that's like a totally forgotten thing. But in 1933, a man named Giuseppe Zangara shot at FDR with a revolver. So there was all this like gun violence that was occurring like 100 years ago, right? So there was enough pressure with these two events, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre with the FDR assassination attempt. There was enough political pressure to get Congress to act, which in a bipartisan manner, which obviously I don't even think could happen now. But based on this whole situation, Congress ended up passing the National Firearms Act of 1934. And really, I guess generally what that act did, it's the NFA of 1934. But what that did, that National Firearms Act, what it did is it imposed an excise tax on the manufacture and sale of certain firearms and accompanying pieces. What it also did is it required the registration of certain firearms. And before I get into this whole thing, I just want to be totally clear about my position on this. I oppose any law restricting firearms, period. The Constitution was written to impose negative liberties on the federal and on the states. God gave me innate rights. God gave me these rights. I couldn't discharge them if I wanted to. The Constitution does not list these rights out. They're innate. I am given no right by the Constitution. The Constitution does not impart rights on me. What the Constitution is a list of negative liberties. The Constitution was written to tell the government what it will and will not do. What the Constitution is designed to do, it's designed to protect my God-given rights from government intrusion and overreach. And when I look at the Constitution, I am a textualist originalist. And if you look at the Second Amendment, it's one of the easiest ones. Shall not be infringed is pretty simple language. Shall not be infringed means exactly that. The founders, when they wrote this Second Amendment, had just fought a war against a tyrannical government. The founders wanted the citizenry, the people, to have access to whatever weapons were available to the military at the time. But if you fast forward to 1934, the NFA law broke that covenant by placing laws and roadblocks on civilian gun ownership, violating the Constitution. Absolutely 100%, this thing is unconstitutional. But even if it was passed, so obviously and not challenged, so here we go. In this bill, well, it was challenged, but it lost. In the bill, in the NFA from 1934, the following items were regulated by this bill. Machine guns, that was number one. But a machine gun was defined as meaning a firearm capable of full auto mode with a selective fire switch. SBRs were on that. That would be a short-barreled rifle. What is a short-barreled rifle? That is a rifle with a barrel less than 16 inches in length. Along with SBRs, you had SBSs. That's short-barrel shotguns. What was outlawed in this deal was that they outlawed smooth-bore barrels less than 18 inches. Well, suppressors were also part of that. And if you don't know what a suppressor is a silencer. Basically what it does is it muffles the report of a discharge. Along with that, you had DDs, which were destructive devices. That would be like a grenade, a bomb, a missile, whatever. So all of those various items were listed as NFA. So that's a new category that the government created for firearms and DDs. So any device that fell into that NFA category needed to be registered and taxed. In the tax I just mentioned a minute ago, that was an excise tax. Well, in 1934, they had to set a fee. So what that fee was $200. That was the tax. So it was a $200 excise tax that was put in the bill. And just for scale, $200 back then was like $5,000 today. It's prohibitive, right? Well, that 1934 NFA law was known as Title II. Well, 2 means that there's a 1. Title I was actually passed in 1968. And really what Title I was a lot less onerous, but still, it's still injurious to the Constitution. Title I basically dealt with interstate gun commerce. It defined people that could not possess firearms, like felons, drug addicts, people like that. What Title I also did is it established FFLs. And what an FFL is a federal firearm license. An FFL is needed to sell firearms. Like an individual or a company, you need an FFL to sell a gun. It is a license to sell firearms. And what that FFL does then is that somebody owns an FFL. They are now a captive to FFL requirements. So the FFL sets the requirements for sale to private citizens. It's regulated. Either which way you want to look at it, the two parts of the NFA, Title I, Title II, regulated firearm ownership in the U.S. So why am I talking about this? So fast forward to today. Well, last year, Congress passed the big, beautiful bill. Well, buried in the big, beautiful bill was a provision. In that hidden provision inside of the big, beautiful bill, reduced the excise tax on NFA weapons. Pardon me. So again, hidden provision. It's going to strike down all the excise taxes on NFA weapons. I said it a minute ago. That excise tax, was placed at $200 back in 1934. The big, beautiful bill, the provision in the bill, reduced the tax to $0. So if you look at Title II of the NFA in 1934, in layman's terms, what this means is that the excise tax provision of the 1934 NFA was removed. So when the $200 fee is removed, the only thing left in that law then is registration of the firearm. This is the beautiful part. Without taxation involved, the government has no right to require registration. If you're not taxing me, it ain't your business. If there is no tax, then it is not the government's business. And the logic there is exactly the key to this entire situation. If the government can tax a right into outer space, then is it really a right? No, it would be a privilege. Does that make sense? If the government can tax your rights, it's not a right. It's something you have to pay to get. So what happened is that now it's coming out that this excise tax was just removed. So you have these gun regulation, like these gun grabber groups, they sued to have this whole thing appealed. Well, I'm glad to report that the Department of Justice declined to look at this. So they're not going to appeal it, which means that this tax, this 92-year-old excise tax, is gone forever. And just to be totally clear, getting into this doesn't mean you can go out and buy a machine gun, right? None of this stuff is deregulated yet. What it does mean, though, is that silencers should be a lot easier to get. I think they're still going to walk through everything on machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns. But silencers should be the first thing that is available. There are still regulations on machine guns, SBRs, SBSs. But I guess if you move away from this and look at this tax removal and all this other stuff, this is a massive win for your civil liberties and for the Second Amendment. Because that's really what the Second Amendment is, and the NRA. Those are civil liberties groups. Again, my position, all of these laws, all of these regulations, they need to go away, but this is a good start. And legally speaking, this is the correct move. If you want to be a textualist or originalist, this is the direction you need to move in. And if you pay attention to our legal system, you are going to see a massive, massive rollback to gun laws in the next few years. There were two massive Supreme Court decisions that occurred in the last 10 years that have started a snowball that this is where we're going to end up. The first case that the Supreme Court looked at was DC versus Heller. The second one was New York State Rifle versus Bruin. Those two cases, and I'm not going to get into all the specifics between Heller and Bruin, but those two cases were effectively the wooden stake in the vampire that is liberal gun laws. And what you're going to see is blue cities and states have these insane gun laws. And every time I look at these laws, these liberal laws in these liberal blue cities and blue states, these are mainly laws that show a complete misunderstanding of the Second Amendment in basic firearm operation. And what you see is they always talk about assault rifles. And absolutely nobody can explain what that means. But assault rifles, AR-15s, have always been on the forefront of gun regulation. And I'm telling you right now that AR-15s are the next horizon here. Where this is going to end up is in the Supreme Court. Like I mentioned, Denver, the city of Denver, had imposed what they called an assault weapons ban that's going to end up at the Supreme Court. Denver is going to lose that battle, and AR-15s are going to be found legal in all 50 states. The Bruin decision, the one that I mentioned, the Supreme Court decision that I mentioned, well, Bruin and Heller both sought to clarify what weapons are in common use. That's the definition. Common use is the key language when you talk about firearm possession and ownership. That's the argument here. So if I look at like a polymer striker fired 17 round 9mm like a Glock, that is ubiquitous. Every single firearms manufacturer now has a polymer striker fired 17 round 9mm pistol. Glock, Sig Sauer, Smith & Wesson. That's what everybody gets now. Everybody has full-sized Glock 17, Glock 19, whatever. But every single manufacturer is churning out striker-fired 9mm pistols. Well, as these companies are churning out these pistols and they're being bought by the population, what that means then is that that firearm is ubiquitous and therefore in common usage. That's the legal definition here. And what that means is that you cannot have selective employment of gun laws in different states. So if a 9mm striker fired pistol is ubiquitous in Texas or Missouri, then it also has to be common in California and New York. You can't have separate carve-outs for states. And if you apply that logic of common usage, you have to look at AR-15s. There are like 35 million AR-15s out there. 35 million. And that's 35 million that we know about. That's a full system AR. And the question you want to ask yourself beyond the 35 million full systems, how many uppers, lowers, receivers are out there? So if you look at it definitionally, my favorite thing on this episode, the AR-15 by any standard of the day is in common use. The AR-15 is the modern sporting rifle in the US. There are more AR-15s in civilian ownership than Ford F-150s on the road. And common utilization is going to end up being what matters here. And I guess good news for everybody that is a fan of the Constitution, the Second Amendment is coming back in a big way. And I alluded to it a minute ago. There's going to be massive rollbacks on gun laws in the next few years. And AR-15s you watch in the next 2 years are going to be made legal in all 50 states. But I absolutely love America watching something like this. Getting rid of a 92-year-old excise tax, that is amazing. Firearms broadly built America, and they are a constitutional right. And I'm very glad to see all this occurring. And if you ask me, we need more ARs. We need more ARs. We need more 9mm pistols. And I realize that this whole conversation about gun laws and firearms, I understand that it can be a sensitive issue for some people, but the problem that I have with that is freedom is not safe. Freedom isn't safe. Life isn't safe. And anybody that sits around and thinks that the government can keep you safe has never read a history book or they're totally naive. And me personally, as somebody that's cheering on the rolling back of all these gun laws, I'm not a fan of trading away my constitutional rights for a temporary perception of safety. Those rights are my rights, not the government's. And I think what it is that emotions cause gun laws. You see a bad situation, like, you know what? The government needs to do something about it. Emotional decisions and emotional handling of situations create onerous gun laws. Those gun laws will never keep you safe. Bad guys are always going to have guns. That's why they're bad guys. They're criminals. They can get guns, I promise. But look, all of this makes me very, very happy because when you look at like a Spain, a France, and England, and Ireland, the citizens of those countries have absolutely no way to fight the tyranny that is now knocking on their front door. Voting apparently won't work anymore. America, when you look at America, America is the last best hope for free people globally. Guns and gun ownership cement that freedom. The less the government is involved in guns, the happier I am as a person. So brighter days ahead for everyone. So I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. for today. I should be doing a show later this week. I'm going out of town tomorrow, but I'll be back. And again, I've got a ton of content, so I'm looking forward to doing another show this week. But if you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.